The clock on Kendrick Robinson's dashboard read 8:42 a.m. as he pulled his car into the lot outside the municipal courthouse in Greenville, South Carolina. The morning sunlight streamed down, casting long shadows across the asphalt, making everything seem quiet, except Kendrick. He exhaled deeply, frustration written across his face. He hated being late. As a federal prosecutor, discipline and preparedness were his lifeblood. Every minute counted, and today had already slipped away from him. This wasn't supposed to be a complicated morning. No, today should have been routine. A simple challenge to a property tax adjustment on the house his grandmother had left him. The city had inexplicably raised the taxes, and Kendrick had spent weeks gathering proof it was a mistake. The house was more than just property to him. It was the foundation of his childhood, the place where his grandmother had shaped his values, taught him right from wrong. Dressed in a dark navy suit and a crisp white shirt, Kendrick looked every bit the seasoned attorney he was. Even if the morning had been anything but smooth, a sudden phone call about an ongoing human trafficking case had delayed him. Last-minute motions from the defense team that couldn't be ignored. After reviewing the documents and providing feedback to his team, he had rushed to court, knowing he was cutting it close. As he neared the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. His assistant at the U.S. Attorney's office had sent a message. The judge in Greenville has a reputation for being tough on latecomers. Be careful. Kendrick sighed, tucking his phone into his briefcase. He wasn't worried. Facts were his weapon. He came armed with evidence. But something about that message lingered, like a shadow he couldn't shake. He pushed it aside and stepped into the cool interior of the courthouse. The contrast between this building and the federal courtrooms Kendrick was accustomed to was stark. The walls here were dull beige, the seats scuffed from decades of use. The air carried a faint scent of coffee and old paper, giving the place a lived-in, worn-down feel. Despite its tired appearance, the courthouse hummed with activity. People shuffled in and out, clutching stacks of documents, faces anxious over minor disputes, parking tickets, and other small claims. Kendrick checked his watch. 8:50 a.m. 10 minutes to spare. Barely enough time to find the right courtroom. He followed the signs down a narrow hallway, passing people murmuring in hushed tones. He stopped at room 204. Judge Charles Whitman's name was etched in brass on the door. Kendrick straightened his tie and stepped inside. The courtroom was already filling up. Kendrick found a seat near the back, flipping open his folder to review his evidence. As he scanned his notes, he noticed the judge entering, Judge Charles Whitman. A tall man with a silver mane and piercing blue eyes, he commanded attention without uttering a word. His presence alone was enough to make the room fall silent. His reputation for being no-nonsense was clear in the way he scanned the room, his sharp gaze missing nothing. All rise, the bailiff called, and the room shuffled to its feet. Kendrick stood straight, his posture as disciplined as always. The judge took his seat, and the room fell into a heavy, almost oppressive silence. Judge Whitman began calling cases with mechanical efficiency. His tone was crisp, detached, as though he had already heard it all before. Kendrick watched carefully. A middle-aged man in a suit arrived a few minutes late, slipping in quietly. No reprimand. Then, a young woman in casual clothes snuck in and took a seat, barely a glance from the judge. Kendrick made a mental note, but kept his focus on his own case. Finally, at 9:15 a.m., his name was called. He gathered his folder and approached the podium, projecting calm despite the slight delay. As he did, he felt the shift in the room, an almost imperceptible tension, like a quiet storm building. The judge looked up, his expression hardening. This was different. "You're late, Mr. Robinson." Judge Whitman's voice sliced through the stillness. "Do you think the court's time is less valuable than your own?" Kendrick raised his hand slightly in acknowledgement. "Here it comes. Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to urgent federal matters." The judge didn't let him finish. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness. This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, I suggest you reevaluate your priorities." The weight of dozens of eyes suddenly felt heavier than ever. Kendrick stood tall, refusing to show any sign of weakness. He chose his words carefully, his voice steady. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of timeliness. If I may, I'd like to present my case regarding the property tax adjustment. Judge Whitman waved his hand dismissively. We'll get to that. First, there's the matter of contempt. Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings. He paused, then delivered the hammer blow. You are hereby fined $750. The words hung in the air, a heavy strike. Kendrick's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. The murmurs rippled through the room. Your Honor, Kendrick began again, his tone calm but firm. May I explain? The judge raised his gavel, silencing him with a sharp motion. You may not. Consider this a lesson in respecting the court. Kendrick stepped back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about tardiness. No, it was about something deeper, something that couldn't be ignored. He glanced at the other latecomers, a young woman scrolling on her phone, a man in a gray blazer who had walked in after the judge. They had been spared the judge's wrath. The disparity was glaring, and Kendrick wasn't about to let it slide. He returned to his seat, but this time, he didn't open the property tax documents. He pulled out a pen and began scribbling furiously on his notepad. His mind raced. This wasn't just a small moment. This was something bigger. As the judge moved on to the next case, Kendrick continued to write, his pen moving swiftly across the page. The room proceeded, but Kendrick's presence had already shifted the atmosphere. He could feel the eyes on him, the tension in the air. Something had changed, and he wasn't done. He wasn't going to let this go. The court clerk's fingers danced over the keyboard, but every now and then she hesitated. Kendrick noticed. He wasn't the only one paying attention. An older black man sitting 2 rows ahead of him turned slightly, giving Kendrick a brief, knowing glance. Kendrick nodded ever so slightly. He wasn't alone. And this wasn't over. Kendrick made a quiet decision, a promise to himself. This moment wasn't just about a fine or a delay. It was about something more, something bigger, and he would make sure that it was noticed. As the session ended, Kendrick remained still, watching as the crowd filed out, each person carrying an unspoken weight from the day's proceedings. His eyes lingered on a young law student in the corner, furiously scribbling in her notebook. Her face was a mixture of awe and determination, like someone who had just caught a glimpse of a bigger truth. Kendrick left the courtroom, his briefcase in hand, but his mind was already working, already forming a plan. This was no longer just about a property tax adjustment or a minor fine. No, this was about something much larger, something he couldn't ignore, something that demanded action. The air outside was crisp, yet it did little to ease the tension still knotted inside him. The courthouse buzzed with the hum of routine, a world of ordinary, mundane legal proceedings. But in Kendrick's mind, the weight of the morning's events hung heavy. A decision was taking root, and it was undeniable. He paused on the courthouse steps, his eyes fixed on his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact for his assistant, the U.S. attorney back at the office. Not yet, he muttered to himself, taking a deep breath. There was something bigger at play here, something more profound. Kendrick stepped aside, reviewing his notes once again. He replayed the interactions he'd witnessed, the unequal treatment he'd observed. It wasn't just an anomaly, it was systemic. His legal instincts were sharp, and they told him something he couldn't ignore. This was the beginning of a much larger case, one that reached far beyond property taxes or personal grievances. Back in his car, Kendrick opened his briefcase, pulling out his badge and credentials. The U.S. prosecutor's emblem, embossed in gold, caught the light streaming through the windshield. It gleamed almost symbolically. This was it. This would be his first move. By the time Kendrick re-entered the courtroom, most of the morning cases had already concluded. The room was quieter now, with only a few lingering figures flipping through papers or waiting their turn. Judge Whitman was seated at the bench, flipping through documents, his exhaustion apparent. Kendrick approached confidently, badge and identification in hand. As he walked to the podium, the court clerk paused mid-typing, her eyes rising to meet his. Judge Whitman, his mood darkening instantly, glanced up. Mr. Robinson, he snapped, the session is over. If you have further business, you'll need to schedule an appointment. With all due respect, Your Honor, Kendrick began, his voice calm yet carrying a quiet authority. I believe it's important to formally introduce myself. He held up his badge slightly, making sure it was visible to everyone in the room. "I'm Kendrick Robinson, Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of South Carolina. I've been with the Department of Justice for over a decade, focusing on cases involving human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations." The judge froze, his hands halting mid-motion. The color drained from his face as Kendrick's words hung in the air, sending a ripple through the room. The remaining spectators, some curious, some nervous, watched wide-eyed. "I was late this morning," Kendrick continued, his tone firm but respectful, "because of an urgent federal case that required my immediate attention. And while I understand the importance of court procedures, I couldn't help but notice a disparity in how cases were handled today." Judge Whitman's lips tightened. "Mr. Robinson, if you believe there was a procedural issue, you are welcome to file a formal complaint." Kendrick didn't flinch. "I've already begun documenting the events of this morning," he said, pulling out his notebook. "Not just my own treatment, but the differing responses to other latecomers, particularly along racial lines. As an officer of the court, I'm obligated to report any patterns of bias or discrimination I encounter." Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, visibly uneasy. "Are you accusing this court of misconduct?" Kendrick's response was measured, calm. "I'm stating what I observed, Your Honor. As a federal prosecutor, I've dedicated my career to ensuring that justice is applied equally, regardless of who stands before the bench. What I witnessed today raises serious concerns." The silence that followed was deafening. The court clerk glanced nervously between Kendrick and the judge, unsure of what to do. The young law student in the back corner continued to scribble in her notes, her eyes wide with fascination. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "This court takes such matters seriously. If you believe there was an error in judgment, I suggest addressing it through the appropriate channels." Kendrick placed his badge on the podium, his words unwavering. "I intend to, Your Honor. But I also believe this moment presents an opportunity for reflection on how we ensure the principles of fairness and equality are upheld in every courtroom." Judge Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests. For the first time in decades of presiding over that courtroom, his authority seemed questioned. "You may go, Mr. Robinson," he muttered, his voice softer, quieter than before. Kendrick turned to leave, but not before one last statement. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll ensure this is addressed properly." As he walked out, Kendrick could feel the weight of every remaining gaze on him. The moment wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about challenging a system that was all too comfortable with its own flaws. Outside, Kendrick pulled out his phone, typing a detailed email to his office. Every observation, every interaction, every instance of disparity he'd witnessed. He hit send, and as the message flew off, he knew this was only the beginning. The next morning his phone buzzed. It was Julia Harper, his supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's Office. "Kendrick, I read your report," she said, her voice sharp with both urgency and intrigue. "If what you're describing is accurate, this isn't a one-off situation. This could be systemic bias." Kendrick nodded, his mind already racing. "I believe it is," he replied. "What happened yesterday wasn't subtle. It's part of a pattern I've seen before. And I'm sure I'm not the only one." Julia's response came quickly. "I'll reach out to the Judicial Review Commission. This needs to be handled delicately, but thoroughly. In the meantime, gather as much documentation as you can. If this goes public, we need to be ready." The call ended, but Kendrick's work had just begun. Hours passed as he meticulously pieced together every detail from the courtroom session. He combed through public records, comparing fines and penalties. Patterns emerged. Black defendants were fined significantly more than white defendants for the same offenses. Late arrivals from white defendants went unnoticed, while black defendants faced reprimands or steep fines. Kendrick's resolve strengthened. This was no longer just about him. It was about a systemic problem that needed to be exposed. As the days passed, the investigation gained momentum. The Judicial Review Commission launched a formal inquiry, and the evidence was damning. Kendrick's meticulous documentation, combined with stories from former defendants, painted a chilling picture of bias, one that had been carefully hidden under the guise of courtroom proceedings. The story began to leak into the local community. A law student present that day posted a detailed account on social media. Within hours, the story went viral, sparking outrage and bringing more testimonies to light. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon, Kendrick found himself at the center of a growing storm. Judge Whitman, who had long held power and authority in his courtroom, now faced increasing pressure. He began to realize the magnitude of what was happening. Kendrick's actions had ignited something bigger than he could have imagined. The investigation was only the beginning. As the pressure inside the courthouse escalated, a shift began to ripple through the very walls that had once harbored a toxic, hidden truth. Staff members who had worked quietly under Judge Whitman for years now found their voices rising, each revelation adding fuel to the fire. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, had been keeping meticulous notes for years, notes that now served as the foundation for a damning case of bias that spanned decades. "I never thought anyone would listen," she confessed during an interview with investigators. "But now that it's all coming out, I can't stay silent anymore." It was a statement that struck like a bell toll. And Mrs. Thompson was just one voice among many. Even James Wilson, the seasoned bailiff, who had watched the court's inequities unfold before his eyes year after year, spoke out. His statement to the commission was clear and unwavering. "I've seen this kind of treatment for years. It's wrong. And it's long past time for something to be done." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. Meanwhile, Judge Whitman, once untouchable, found himself increasingly isolated. He initially dismissed the allegations as simple misunderstandings, but as the evidence mounted, even he could no longer deny what was unfolding. In a rare public statement, he expressed regret for any unintentional actions that may have caused harm. Yet those words fell flat, hollow in the face of overwhelming proof. They felt like a feeble attempt at damage control, far too little, far too late. And then there was Kendrick. Amid the frenzy of attention, he remained grounded, focused on the work that still lay ahead. His responsibilities as a federal prosecutor extended far beyond this one case. Yet he couldn't escape the barrage of messages flooding his office. Emails, phone calls, letters, all from people across the country. Some offered support. Others shared their own heartbreaking stories of bias in courtrooms nationwide. One letter, in particular, moved Kendrick deeply. It came from a retired attorney in Alabama, who wrote, "For years, I saw the same injustices you're describing. But I never spoke up. Thank you for having the courage to do what so many of us couldn't." The movement Kendrick had sparked was growing, gaining momentum, reaching beyond the walls of Greenville to touch communities across the country. In South Carolina, as investigative reporters dug deeper into court records, other judges began to feel the heat. The state's Judicial Oversight Committee was forced to act, launching a sweeping review of municipal courts with the goal of rooting out systemic bias. And when the Judicial Review Commission released its preliminary findings at the end of the month, the truth was undeniable. Judge Whitman's actions were not an isolated incident. They were part of a deeply ingrained, long-standing issue. The report called for sweeping reforms, mandatory bias training for judges, regular audits of court decisions, and the establishment of independent oversight committees. The pressure became too much. Judge Whitman, faced with the prospect of a public hearing and potential disciplinary action, resigned. In a brief statement, he said, "I believe it's in the best interest of this court and this community that I step aside." His resignation was met with a mixture of reactions. Some saw it as an admission of guilt, while others viewed it as a step toward healing. For Kendrick, it was a moment of vindication, but not of celebration. He knew the battle wasn't over. This was merely the beginning. The real work lay ahead. Kendrick became a sought-after speaker, invited to law schools, community forums, and legal conferences to share his experience and highlight the importance of challenging systemic bias. At one event, a young Black law student approached him with wide eyes. "You've shown me that the law isn't just about rules," she said. "It's about people. You've given me a reason to fight for justice." Kendrick smiled, humbled by her words, knowing full well that this fight was far from over. "The fight is just beginning," he replied. "But if we all do our part, we can make the system better." 3 months after that pivotal morning, The courthouse in Greenville looked completely transformed. Gone were the tired beige walls, replaced with fresh paint, and a welcoming desk at the entrance. New signs in multiple languages now guided people to resources they hadn't known were available: payment plans, legal aid, and procedural guides. And just inside the entrance, a small plaque hung proudly: "Equal justice is everyone's right." Inside the courthouse, the changes were even more pronounced. Judge Whitman was gone, quietly removed from the bench following his resignation. In his place was a younger judge with a reputation for fairness and impartiality. And the changes didn't stop there. Systemic reforms were already taking shape. All court personnel were now required to attend bias training, led by experts who taught them to recognize the subtle ways in which discrimination could creep into decision-making. Kendrick stood at the back of the newly renovated courtroom, his eyes scanning the room. He had been invited to speak to a group of local judges and lawyers about the changes that had been implemented. As he waited for his turn, a sense of pride mixed with cautious optimism washed over him. Change had begun, but he knew the journey was far from over. The ripple effects were felt beyond Greenville. Other communities in South Carolina, and eventually across the country, began reevaluating their own court systems. State judicial review boards mandated audits of case outcomes, focusing on racial and socioeconomic disparities. Oversight committees, composed of legal experts, community advocates, and former defendants, were formed to monitor court proceedings and ensure accountability. In Kendrick's office, the momentum was palpable. His fine from that fateful morning now hung framed on his wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of why he had taken a stand. Below it was a photo from a recent event, showing a group of young law students who had started a civil rights clinic in his honor. Their smiles radiated hope, and Kendrick couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility toward the next generation of legal minds. The changes continued to reverberate through the courthouse. James Wilson, the veteran bailiff who had once served under Judge Whitman, was now leading bias training sessions for court officers. "Our job isn't just to keep order," he told a room filled with new hires. "It's to ensure that everyone who steps into this room is treated with dignity. If you see something wrong, you speak up. Silence is complicity." Mrs. Thompson, whose meticulous records had played a pivotal role in the investigation, was now overseeing a new program focused on ethical court practices. She worked tirelessly to mentor younger clerks, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. Kendrick's influence extended beyond the legal community. He began teaching a seminar at a nearby law school, focusing on ethics and civil rights in the judiciary. His students, many inspired by his story, often stayed after class to ask how they could make a difference. One afternoon, a student approached him, notebook in hand, filled with ideas for reform. "What do you think is the most important thing we can do to make the system fairer?" she asked. Kendrick thought for a moment, then responded, "Listen to each other. To the people who come through our courts, and to those who are too afraid to speak up. Listening is where real change begins." Despite resistance from some judges and attorneys, who bristled at the new oversight measures, the evidence was clear. Within a year, the data showed a significant decrease in racial disparities in fines and sentences. In Greenville's municipal court, payment plans were approved more frequently, and defendants reported feeling treated with more respect. For Kendrick, the most rewarding moments came from the people who approached him to share their stories. One morning, an elderly black man, who had been in the courtroom that day months ago, returned to thank him. "I've been coming here for 40 years, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've seen so much injustice, but I never thought I'd see the day when someone finally said enough. Thank you for giving us hope." One afternoon, Kendrick received a letter from a young public defender in Chicago, who had been inspired to start her own investigation into biases in her local courts. "Your stand reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place," she wrote. Kendrick read the letter twice, then placed it in a folder labeled Impact. He leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the moment settle. It wasn't about him. It never had been. It was about the countless voices that had been silenced or ignored for too long. Voices that were finally being heard. Months later, Kendrick returned to the courthouse where it all began. This time, he wasn't there for a case or an investigation. He had been invited to speak at the unveiling of a new judicial ethics center, named in part after his efforts. As he stepped up to the podium, he looked out at the crowd, judges, lawyers, clerks, and community members, and took a deep breath. Justice isn't just about laws, Kendrick began. It's about how we treat the people who come into our courtrooms. It's about fairness, dignity, and respect. And it's about ensuring that every person, no matter who they are, knows that they matter. The applause was thunderous, but Kendrick's focus remained on the faces in the crowd. In their eyes, he saw hope, determination, and the beginnings of real change. And though he knew the work was far from over, Kendrick couldn't help but feel that, at last, they were heading in the right direction.